Hello, everyone. Good evening and welcome to another, what promises to be another brilliant installment in the Yunus Emre Arts and Culture series. We have a very special guest with us today. A quick introduction to myself before we begin. My name is Yahya Nurgat. I'm a PhD student at the University of Cambridge, where I'm researching religious and ritual experiences of the Hajj in the early modern Ottoman period. So I'm especially looking forward to this presentation. And in fact, Professor Petersen's book was one of the first that I looked at when I was starting out my PhD to really understand the terrain that pilgrims were crossing when they were making the pilgrimage. Quick note on Yunus Emre. So you can follow the Yunus Emre Institute on all the usual social media platforms. And I know a lot of you are tuning in from Twitter and Instagram and things like that. So there's a lot of wonderful activities going on at the Institute, normally in person, but they've done a great job of taking things online like everyone else. So as well as the Turkish and Ottoman Turkish courses, they've got courses available in various arts and crafts, especially calligraphy, paper marbling, illumination, and so much more, as well as these talks that are occurring monthly or every month. They've also got the Young Scholar Series and really other exciting lectures lined up as well. So sign up to the mailing list and to the social media channels. So with us today is Professor Andrew Petersen. Andrew is Director of Research in Islamic Archaeology at the University of Wales, Trinity St. David. It's a bit of a mouthful.
Yeah, it's too long. Yeah.
And he's worked in and carried out research in a number of countries across the Middle East and Africa. His main research interests are the Hajj, Muslim shrines, and Islamic archaeology in Britain. He's published many articles on his research, as well as a number of books, the latest and the most recent of which is an archaeological and historical study of the medieval.
Hello? Screen's frozen. Hello? Yeah, okay. Okay, yes, yeah. Well, thank you, Yahya, for that. Yes, yeah. So what I'd like to do now, thank you for the introduction, and I'm very pleased to be talking to the Yunus Emre Institute. I've been working in one way or another on the Ottoman Hajj for most of my academic career. Now, I've worked on lots of other things, but I keep on coming back to the Ottoman Hajj, the Syrian Ottoman Hajj. That is the pilgrimage route from Damascus to Mecca, because it's one of those things which there are so many dimensions to it and so many things which can be investigated. It's sort of impossible to really finish. But I should explain, I suppose, my involvement in looking at the Ottoman Hajj, which really started when, a long time ago, just after I'd finished my undergraduate work, I was offered the opportunity to go to Jordan, and there I found a few small Ottoman buildings which nobody had really studied before. So then, for my original sort of dissertation, I actually worked on these, and I've not really been able to sort of let go of them ever since. And so the work that I've carried out has mostly been survey work, which means visiting a lot of the sites and looking at the actual route that pilgrims used to take. And also I've done some excavation, and also produced many publications and also a few exhibitions on this. So now what I'm going to do is just take you, the idea is to give you an idea of the pilgrimage route, the Ottoman pilgrimage route, and just look at a few sites along the route. And then maybe at the end of this short presentation, then I think we'll have a discussion with Yahya. So and now I need to share the screen, which should be this. Okay. Now, as many of you will know, the Ottoman Empire really emerged out of the territories conquered by the Ottoman dynasty, starting with Osman in the late 1200s. And by 1453, which you should get in the next, hang on, how do we go, yeah. By 1450, Ottomans had been very successful in terms of warfare, but also in terms of the way they actually governed their territories, and they were able to expand. The 1400s, they'd acquired a huge amount of territory from a very small beginnings, and you can see on this map from 1481, you can see the extent of their territory. So it included most of Anatolia, or modern Turkey, Greece, Bulgaria, Serbia, and also some territories around the Black Sea. So they were already successful, and also in 1453 they achieved what became their ultimate goal, which is the conquest of Constantinople. So with the conquest of Constantinople, the Ottomans really became a very powerful dynasty, ruling most of a large proportion of the former Byzantine Empire, and they were very conscious of this, and to a certain extent saw themselves as like a continuation of the emperors of Rome. So this is very much they saw themselves as having great responsibilities in this respect, and certainly when they occupied Constantinople, they're very keen to maintain the many of the ancient buildings in Constantinople, and maintain many of the traditions that the Byzantines and before them the Romans had kept up. So there's very much a sense of continuity, but also a sense of responsibility of being a great empire. But one thing you'll notice from the map is that really at this stage, even when they're quite a large empire, the Ottomans were really had no real contact with the Arab world. They bordered it, but really they were not part of that. And the Arab world, most of the Arab world at that time was ruled by the Mamluk Sultanate, who were based in Cairo. Their capital was Cairo, and to a certain extent Damascus. So they're a Syrian-Egyptian set of rulers that ruled this area. But then in 1512, you get a new Ottoman Sultan, Sultan Selim, and he actually expanded the empire by conquering Syria and Egypt. So expanding the empire And so by the middle of the 16th century, the middle of the 1500s, the empire had extended to include most of the former Byzantine territories, in fact, that the Byzantines had occupied before the Islamic conquest. So in a strange way, by conquering these lands, in a sense, the Ottomans had kind of recreated the early Byzantine Empire and created a huge territory. But the other important thing, of course, is that now they included Arabs amongst their subjects. And also the other significant thing is that by incorporating the Middle East, Syria and Egypt, they're also incorporating a population which by this time was largely Muslim. So whereas many of the subjects of the Ottomans in Europe and even in Anatolia were Christian, now with the occupation of Syria and Egypt and Arabia and North Africa, they'd acquired a population which was both Arabic speaking and predominantly Muslim. So this is a big transition. And the other thing that's important, of course, is that they suddenly became very much aware of the Islamic heritage of these areas, and they became aware of the resonance of cities like Damascus, Jerusalem, and Cairo for Muslims around the world. So they acquired, in a sense, a new responsibility. Now, part of that responsibility was organising an annual pilgrimage, the Hajj, to Mecca. Now, as part of this, they sought to revive the principal pilgrimage route from Damascus to Mecca. Now, under the Mamluks, who were based in Egypt, the Egyptian pilgrimage route from Cairo to Mecca was very important, and to a certain extent the Syrian pilgrimage route was neglected. And in fact it had been neglected for quite a long time, because if you think further back, before the Mamluks, much of the area of Syria and, well, certainly Palestine, was controlled by the Crusaders, who caused severe disruption to the Syrian route. So really, the Ottoman work on the Syrian Hajj route was really a revival of the ancient pilgrimage route. Now, here we have, here you'll see a picture of the Great Mosque in Damascus, built by the Umayyad Caliph Al-Walid in 706 AD. And I'll just say a little bit about the importance of Damascus and Syria, I suppose, to Muslims and to Islam. One of the important things that's worth mentioning is that Syria had a direct connection with Mecca in pre-Islamic times, and that goes way back to I suppose the time of the Nabateans and earlier. There's direct trade through Western Arabia, through the region of Hijaz, carrying trade from Yemen, incense, and also further afield from India, up through the Hijaz to Mecca. And the terminus of this trade was in Syria, specifically the important town of Bosra, although obviously the trade went on to Damascus. In a sense, the city of Bosra in southern Syria was in a sense an extension of the Hijaz in some ways. So you get Hijazi merchants living in Bosra in southern Syria, but also visiting Damascus. And one of the interesting things is that Muhammad's ancestor initiated annual caravans with camels carrying wheat from the southern Syria to Mecca. So there's an important pre-Islamic. This is an important pre-Islamic route. And also it's important in religious terms, of course, because it's well known that Muhammad himself worked as a merchant and actually traded into Syria. So he personally actually visited Syria. So in Muslim terms, I suppose, the Syrian pilgrimage route, the route between Damascus and Mecca is kind of one of the oldest route and also the most sacred. So this is, on the Ottomans' part, this is very much a conscious decision to revive the Ottoman Hajj route. So one of the things they did, the Ottomans did, soon after they conquered the area, is they renovated the cities of Syria. So in Jerusalem, famously, they rebuilt the city walls, renovated the water systems, and renovated the Dome of the Rock. Within Damascus, they built lots of things like this, which is the Khan Assad Pasha caravanserai, or Bedestan, in the center of Damascus. And this is really promoting trade between Syria and Anatolia, the rest of the Ottoman Empire, but also trade with Mecca and the Hijaz to the south. Because one of the things that comes out in studies of Ottoman Syria is that the major economic event and religious event in Syria really was the annual Hajj, the annual pilgrimage. So really the calendar within Syria revolved around this. So, for example, camels were provided from Syria, wheat from the Haran, all of this. And then if you have a quick look at, this is just a quick view of the map, 19th century map of Damascus. One of the most important things that the Ottomans did as a priority was establishing a pilgrimage center within Damascus itself. So you'll see from this rather old-fashioned map, you'll see a picture of Damascus. The shaded area is the densely built-up urban area, and just to the left of that, they constructed a complex called the Taqiyya, which is a complex comprising a mosque, a soup kitchen, or a place where pilgrims could be provided with food, a Hanafi law school, a souk, and also a large camping ground. So pilgrims coming from further afield could camp by the side of the river here and assemble and get ready for the pilgrimage. So this is really an assembly point. And I'll just ask you to notice as well that the shaded area of the city stretches down to the south. And this area, this extension of Damascus to the south is called the Maidan. And this is like an extended street where people going on the Hajj would actually proceed south along this street. And along the street, there are all sorts of shops, warehouses, and workshops supplying equipment for the Hajj. So if you'd forgotten anything, if you needed work done on the camel litters, or food was provided. So all this entire area was really devoted to Hajj-related activities and commerce. So just to show, this is the mosque, this is the Taqiyya Mosque, which is a very interesting architectural example of a fusion between Syrian architecture and classical Ottoman architecture. I should say that the whole of this complex was designed by the Imperial Architects Corps in Istanbul, presided over by the very famous Ottoman architect Sinan. We know that Sinan had some hand in the design of this, although whether he actually visited the site himself is not really known. So you can see this is another part of the complex. This is part of the law school, and all of this complex was paid for by the revenue from 40 Syrian villages. So this was a very well endowed complex, state-of-the-art complex, you might say, to provide a really fitting start for this very important religious and cultural annual event. Okay. The next thing, okay, so you assemble in Damascus. It depends, you could have come from Constantinople overland, or you could have come by sea, or you could have come from any one of the other areas in the Ottoman Empire. And then you would have assembled at Damascus, which is where the Emir al-Hajj, the official in charge of the pilgrimage, usually one of the governors of Damascus, and he would there start the official pilgrimage, and from there you travel south. The pilgrimage caravan would be composed of mostly camels, people, horses, and there is also a pack of dogs, which also apparently followed the Hajj every year. One thing that's worth saying is from Damascus to Mecca is about 1,000 miles, that's 1,600 kilometers, so it's quite a long way. And the Hajj stopped at certain places, but most of the time it really moved quite quickly, not quickly, but continuously, almost day and night. They're very much predetermined stops along the route, but for a lot of the time the rests were quite short, and the average speed of the caravan was probably about 3 miles an hour, and sometimes quicker, sometimes less quick, but as I said, it was slow enough that it could be followed by some dogs from Damascus who made all the way down to Mecca and back every year. Now, the next slide is just showing you the development of the pilgrimage route. So on the left-hand screen, you'll see the pilgrimage route that the Ottomans had developed by the 1500s with the facilities on it. So there's had about 25 different stations built with facilities built on it between Damascus and Mecca. By the 18th century, they had a lot more. They had 25 different, no, they had more. They had, they had many more stations along the route. And I might talk a little bit more about that later, but for the present, I'd just like to introduce you to a few of the stops. So the first sort of major stop south of Damascus was at a place called Muzarib. And what's interesting about Muzarib, nothing really remains of this building. It was, by 2001, it was almost destroyed, but fortunately we've got some records of the site, and it was also planned by a German archaeology team in the 1980s. And the interesting thing about this is that it appears that this fortress or center was built during the reign of Sultan Selim, so before 1520. So that makes it one of the earliest buildings, Ottoman buildings on the pilgrimage route. And also it says, if you think about the timing of this, really this region had only really been occupied but taken by the Ottomans within a matter of years or months from this. So it's obviously, the pilgrimage was obviously a really important priority for the Ottomans, and that's as early as Selim, who was obviously very busy doing conquests. Afterwards, he also went to Iraq. So it shows really that the pilgrimage was very, very much in the forefront of the minds of the Sultan. So, and the other thing about Muzarib, which is important, so after Damascus, where the pilgrims assembled, there's another stopping point, which is Muzarib, where the pilgrims used to stop for 7 days to collect more people. So you can see right at the beginning, there's a big stop, and then quite soon afterwards there's another stop. And I think part of the reason for this is to assemble latecomers, so people who arrived at Damascus late could hurry down to Mosque to meet the rest of the pilgrims. And so really every opportunity was afforded to, I suppose, which is what we're coming on to. And the reason for this is that the overland trip from Damascus to Mecca was not an easy trip. It's not an easy trip for many reasons, because it was a long way to go, because sometimes the temperatures would get up to 50 degrees, sometimes you'd be going through snow, there were wild animals, and also there was sometimes there's a problem with the Bedouin tribe. So to ease the way, as well as providing this official pilgrimage caravan, the Ottomans also distributed money to the tribes along the way to facilitate the passage of the caravan. So really you wanted to be with the caravan, because if you're outside it, it would have made the pilgrimage very difficult. So also, I'd like to just say a little bit briefly about this. This is one example of one of the sites. This is a place called Mafraq, or Al Fudain, again just south of Mosque. And also, I think I've managed to demonstrate that this building was also built by Sultan Selim. So this is also built within the first 4 years of the Ottoman expansion into Syria. So again, it shows that the mindset was to establish facilities along the Hajj route. Now, the Ottoman fort at Mafraq was known from documents, but the actual site was a bit of a mystery until recently. And then it's become clear recently that actually the site was known, it's just misinterpreted. So the picture you'll see at the moment is a picture of an aerial photograph of a site in the center of the modern Jordanian town of Mafraq, and you'll see a complex comprising 3 parts. So on the left-hand side is a Byzantine complex, in the middle is Umayyad, so that's early Islamic, and the little square building on the right with the untitled place mark on it, that is probably the Ottoman Fort, and you can see another view of it here. So there's the 3 complexes. Behind you see the Byzantine building, then the most visible one is the Umayyad, and then you can just see some little ruins in the front. And then on your right-hand side, there's a plan of the building, which is the Ottoman Fort. Fortunately, some photographs were taken before the fort was. Oh, we haven't got them anyway. Never mind. So that's the Ottoman Fort at Mafraq. Then if we go a little further south, we've got another fort which may have been built by Sultan Selim. So again, remember, this is within the first 4 years of the Ottoman conquest. Although this building was restored many in the 18th century. So really what you're looking at is an 18th century building. But just to give you an idea of the typical arrangement at one of these stations, you get the fort, usually a cistern or a place for providing water for the pilgrims, and then you'd often get things like this. You get graves. So here's some of the graves. Pilgrimage, or a walk of 1,000 miles, often for people who are maybe infirm or elderly, would have been a challenge. So many pilgrims died each year during the Hajj, and many of them were buried by the roadside. We know this, and sometimes they're buried near one of these forts. Now, if we look at inside this fort, just this is the front of the main entrance to the fort. You can see the entranceway with a very elaborately carved lintel above the doorway. And we think that was put there during the reconstruction of this building in the 1700s by Osman Pasha. So this building was built in the 1500s and then rebuilt in the 18th century by Osman Pasha. And it looks like he reused a lintel. Now, just to have a closer look at this lintel. This lintel, we've looked at it in detail, and this lintel is probably it's certainly from the early Islamic period, so from about the 700s, and it probably came from a now vanished Umayyad palace nearby at a place called Zizia. So again, what's interesting in this is there's very much a sense of heritage on this. The Ottomans were very keen to keep this heritage and this great Islamic heritage way back to the time of the Umayyads. And now we can look inside the fort. So this is going through, entering into, and I'm using this example of Kalat Daba because it's relatively complete, and it's many people regard it as a very good example of a typical Hajj fort. So you go in, just a small courtyard in the center with a well, and then when you go inside, there's staircases leading up to an upper floor, and then the ground floor, you'll see a plan of this on the right hand side. The ground floor would have been barrel vaulted rooms where there would have been stores. So probably at this point it's appropriate to say, what was the point of these forts? The forts were there primarily, according to Ottoman sources, really to protect the water supply, because the pilgrimage, the caravan, which would have numbered up to 60,000 people, sometimes between 40 and 60,000 people. Water, as is well known, was a very precious commodity in the desert and needed to be protected from people, particularly Bedouin tribes, taking the water or trying to charge people for using the water. So the forts were established to guard these water supplies. But the forts also had other uses. One was to provide additional emergency supplies for the pilgrimage, so that's what these storerooms would be. And they also acted as sort of post houses, so ways of communicating. So if you needed to get a message back to Damascus or Constantinople on your way down, they could be handed over at one of these forts. So next, I'm going to talk a little bit about the fort at Ma'an. Ma'an is a very important pilgrimage centre in Jordan, and it still is an important pilgrimage centre today. The fort, which you can see on your right, was until the 1980s was a Jordanian prison, and it's now been reconverted into a heritage centre or museum. And you'll see above the doorway, you'll see there's a matriculation or a projecting corbelled device, which would be used for protecting the doorway. The doorway you can just see below. I'll just get a better, and above the doorway, you'll notice some carved decoration. So we'll have more of a look at it here. So this is the carved decoration. It comprises some typical 16th century Ottoman ornamentation and also an inscription. Now, this inscription is very important, and it's been worked on by Mehmet Tutuncu from Leiden. And this was one of the earliest, it's probably the first Turkish inscription in Arabia as a whole, and actually one of the first Ottoman Turkish inscriptions within the Ottoman Empire as a whole, because before that the inscriptions were mostly written in Persian. So this is a very, very important sort of document, in a sense, or monument. And it's also important because it shows, again, it reaffirms the importance attached to the pilgrimage by the Ottomans. So this inscription was is in the name of the Ottoman Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent, Suleiman I, and it's dated to 971 Hijri, 1563. And so this again shows the continuation of Selim's policy, but much expanded, as you might expect, under the Emperor Suleiman. One of the other forts, which I haven't got a photograph at the moment, but one of the other forts within Saudi Arabia, Ottoman Hajj, which also has an inscription of Suleiman, says that the fort was built within 40 days. It took 40 days to build. And to a certain extent, we can gather the idea that building these forts was very much a prestige endeavor by the sultans. And although they may be small, they're in very inaccessible places, and part of the prestige was actually in building these stations right in the middle of nowhere in very remote areas. So next you'll see just a little view of the interior. This is a view of the interior after it was reconverted into a museum, and you can see just again a very similar, very simple arrangement. Storerooms around the bottom, and upstairs there were rooms for the garrison, and also there's also a small mosque as well. But again, very, very simple architecture. But the interesting thing is it's repeated through 26 buildings, so it's kept in this way. But it's the imperial control which is able to replicate this plan throughout the whole of the Syrian route. Now, finally, I'm just getting to the end of this short presentation. We're going to talk about Khalat Madawara, and this is on the border between present-day Jordan and the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. And I think you'll appreciate getting into a very different type of landscape here. You're passing, for one thing, you're passing from the Jordanian highlands down into an area of much lower altitude, a much more arid area, an area with nowhere really, without a guard and without really knowing what you're doing, you could quite easily be killed. So this is a very dangerous area. But the interesting thing is this area didn't actually have, was not provided with any fort during the 16th century or the 17th century. In fact, there's nothing here. So we know that people stopped here during these times, but there's no facilities at all. But during the 18th century, there's a renewed phase of interest in the Syrian Hajj route, and new facilities were provided, and new stations were established. So this fort at Madawara was built in sometime between 1730 and 1733, and it was built, they actually built a cistern in the sand. In fact, a series of 3 cisterns were built in the sand, and they built a fort to guard it. And the water was not obtained locally, but actually had to be brought by camel in water skins to the site, and was filled up each year before the pilgrimage. So this is quite a lot of effort to provide good facilities for the pilgrims, and shows a degree of organization and also commitment to the Hajj, which needs to be understood. Here you'll see this is a picture of the front of the fortress at Madawara. The fort was used subsequently after the Ottoman period. It was used as an Arab Legion base, and it had some damage from warfare. But more recently, the site has been damaged through local Bedouins believing there was treasure buried there, and so we have a lot of damage which has undermined the foundations, and so there's actually very little left of this particular building. And so that's just an introduction to the forts, and I'll just leave you with this final picture. This is from a painting from a Turkish prayer book from the mid-1700s, and so this is how Mecca and Medina would have looked when pilgrims from Madara actually arrived there in the 18th century. So okay, that hopefully that's just a brief introduction to the pilgrimage route so far. Thank you. All right, so I'll stop share. That's it, yeah.
So I've still got your screen up, Andrew. Not sure if you've stopped sharing.
Oh, right, I thought I stopped.
Oh, there we go.
Yeah.
Perfect.
I think
perfect.
I have, yeah.
Well,
okay, good.
First of all, thank you so much for that. I mean, you've really set the scene there, and you've covered a kind of vast period of time and a vast physical terrain, and you've managed to squeeze that into half an hour. So, I mean, really thanks for that. We're going to have some questions kind of filtering in from all the different channels that we're live on, but I'll use moderator's privilege to kick us off. I mean, I've got a few questions here. Maybe we can start with the first one, looking back a little bit. So you mentioned the Darb Zubaydah and you mentioned the Mamluks. So do we see any parallels with this route here with the Darb Zubaydah, which is of course a totally different stretch of land from Kufa to Mecca? And also, what's the kind of continuity like on the Syrian Hajj route from the Mamluks through to the Ottomans? So kind of two-in-one question there.
Okay, good. Yeah, that's good. Now, you're right to mention the Darb Zubaydah. The Darb Zubaydah is probably in some ways the best studied of these Hajj routes, partly because when the Saudi Tourism and Archaeology Commission began work, one of their first priorities was actually to investigate the Darb Zubaydah, which connected, as is well known, connected Mecca and Medina with Iraq, and was an Abbasid project. And so that's very well studied. And we also know of the town or city of Rabada, which was established on that route, and so that within Saudi Arabia, that's very well studied, although the portions in Iraq less so. And that is to a certain extent, and what the Ottomans were doing is in some way is similar to that. But the thing that I suppose hasn't been done, but we're pretty sure it's there, is that actually there was an Umayyad, so early Islamic Umayyad Hajj route from Damascus. And so we think, for example, the desert castles, which people may know about, the Umayyad desert castles in Jordan and Syria, but particularly in Jordan, were probably connected with this. And so, for example, the lintel which I showed you for Zizia, that was, we think there was probably a pilgrimage station there built by the Umayyads. And we also have at Ma'an, another of the forts we talked about, We know there's a huge reservoir built there by the Umayyads. So there probably was a lot of infrastructure, Umayyad infrastructure. And in fact, something which I didn't talk about, one of the sites that we excavated one of the sites. We found an earlier building there, which was probably also Umayyad. I haven't actually said that in print yet, but we're pretty sure that it is an Umayyad. So yes, the Umayyads probably did have establish a route, and that's it hasn't been studied because it's kind of obscured by later buildings. And the other thing to remember, of course, with the Umayyads is that the history of the Umayyads was written much later, so their contributions are often overlooked, I suppose. So yeah, but what the Ottomans were doing, I think they were very conscious of their heritage, I suppose, and so they were trying to, they were very conscious of their responsibilities, although, yeah, okay, that's it, yeah.
I mean, following on from that, it really struck me when you're talking about how soon Hajj infrastructure was being built after the Mamluk conquest. I mean, you're talking about the initial few years. So is there a lot of evidence that the Ottomans are straight away kind of embarking on this big Hajj infrastructure building program, or is it something more moderate?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, the other element to the Hajj route, the pilgrimage route, the other element to it, I suppose, is to a certain extent, certainly the 16th century buildings, to a certain extent, it may have a military purpose as well, because as well as establishing connections to pilgrims, it also means that if you're sending armies to, for example, we know that when Evliya Çelebi travelled on the pilgrimage route, he was actually going as part of an expedition to Yemen. And so to a certain extent, it could be that, for example, the big complex at Muzarib may have originally been built as a military fortress, really as part of the pacification of, or way of controlling Syria. There's that, but also I think it's quite. It does seem to be quite conscious also that they were. Even Selim was conscious of the importance of this area. And we know he advised the Mamluks earlier. He'd been to the Red Sea. We knew that he was conscious of the area. He had some awareness of this area, and so I think it was probably one of the reasons behind conquering this area. Yes.
I mean, I'll try and not ask too many more questions because I have got some nice questions coming in. Do we know of any kind of pilgrim travel to Jerusalem, and whether there was some sort of official infrastructure set up for that?
But do you mean Muslim pilgrimage to Jerusalem, or for the Christians? Because I'll just say quickly. Yeah. Well, one of the interests. Yeah, that's very interesting. Okay, the Mamluks had been very kind of reticent about allowing Christians to come to Jerusalem, and I mean largely because of the Franciscans being peaceful, they started to allow them probably in larger numbers from the 14th century, but they're quite reluctant. But under the Ottomans were quite happy to allow pilgrims, Christian pilgrims. So, for example, Jaffa was kind of rebuilt to a certain extent to allow Christian pilgrims to arrive by sea, and then a tremendous infrastructure was a lot of infrastructure was renewed in Jerusalem, and they built water systems, the Dome of the Rock. So yeah. In terms of sort of pilgrimage, I suppose it would be quite easy to connect these two pilgrimage networks, and I think we don't have any direct evidence of well, actually we do know that actually some of the fortresses within Jordan were supplied from Palestine, and so we know that there was transport backwards and forwards, and we also know that some of even the pilgrimage forts right out in the desert were supplied from Palestine. So there were connections, and we also know that there are some pilgrims who did both, who did visit Jerusalem and then went on to Mecca. So yeah, I think they were very much, they were connected, but there's no, in terms of sort of infrastructure, there was no direct linkage. Yeah.
So moving forward a little bit, we have a little bit of interest from our people who have tuned in about the Hijaz Railway. Yeah. So one of our viewers is saying, did the Damascus-Medina Railway follow the camel route or the land route? And the other question is, was the caravan route still functional when the Damascus Railroad was established?
Yes, yeah. Well, but first of all, I think the Hijaz Railway followed very closely to the camel route, and that's quite interesting. I mean, I think because, as you may know, railways they sometimes have to take quite strange routes because they can't have very steep slopes on them, because it doesn't work, particularly in the past with early trains in the early 20th century. So, but also steep slopes or steep inclines don't work that well with camels, or certainly when you're dealing with a huge caravan like this. So there's one main area where I think where the caravan route and the railway route diverge, and that's that's south of Ma'an, where there's a big escarpment, and the railway had to go on a different route. But for most of the route, it was the same. And so a lot of the engineers who were building the Hijaz Railway, they actually stayed in the forts. It's worth saying, by the way, I should have pointed out that by the middle or the latter part of the 19th century, the numbers of people going by camel using this route had declined rapidly. And that was because, although there wasn't a railway to Mecca and Medina at that time, there were steamships operating in the Red Sea. So it was both cheaper and quicker for the majority of pilgrims to go to Egypt and then to go by boat. So the number of pilgrims actually using the overland route in the late 1800s was very few. So Doughty, he was only with about 100 pilgrims doing his pilgrimage. So it had declined quite a lot. But yeah, so there's in general, there's quite a lot of similarity in routes. Yeah.
Quick question on that. I mean, so how resilient are these fortresses then? Because if they're being used less as steamships come in, and based on your own work in situ, how resilient have these been against the elements, against people like Bedouins looking for lost treasures and that kind of thing? Exactly. And also, do you then see a similar kind of hands-off approach from the Ottoman authorities, where they maybe stop sending manpower or just stop maintaining the buildings?
Yeah, good. Yeah, that's I think that's actually a very interesting question, and it's because it says quite a lot about both the Ottoman Empire, the priorities attached to this, and a lot of it sort of relates to a lot of other complexities. But briefly, I'd say what's very obvious is from the very first time the Ottomans gain control of this area, they invest in it heavily, even in these very remote areas, building a fort, for example, in Saudi Arabia in 40 days with craftsmen from Damascus. So they did that. But what's very, very clear is in the 1600s, 1700s, when we know the Ottoman Empire was in crisis for whatever reasons, there's a number of different reasons, there are no new forts built, and there's only one feature on the Hajj route that's built, which is actually quite interesting, which is a bridge. There's one bridge built in the middle of the desert in the 1600s, but apart from that, there's nothing else. And then we get a renewal of interest in the 18th century, which says a little bit probably about revival of within the Ottoman Empire at that time, but also I think it says something about what was happening. And I think this is sort of one of the, for me anyway, it's one of the values of an archaeological or material cultures approach to this, because you can look, we know quite a lot about these places from documents. And so to a certain extent, you can say some of this material is illustrative. But one of the interesting things when you actually examine the buildings is you see a very different type of architecture in the 16th century and 18th century. There's a big change. And the change is to do with the way they make sort of gun slits, arrow slits, parapets and towers, and all these are redesigned in the 18th century. And they're redesigned, when you look at them, they're redesigned because for a different type of weapon, for handheld guns, not rifles, but guns, which could be handheld. And so they look a lot more serious in terms of the much more military, the 18th century buildings. And the other thing which I mentioned briefly is the fact that in the 18th century, so about a third of these buildings were built in the 16th century, 2/3 were built in the 18th century. And in the 18th century, they decided to cover so you're never more than a day's march from one of these forts in the 18th century. Now, why is this?
Just for context, context, if you just mentioned the total traveling time between, I don't know, let's say Damascus and Medina, and how long maybe on average it would take from each to each fortress.
Yeah, so okay, so the average traveling time is about 30 days. And for the whole thing, and but so really in the 16th century the location of the forts was slightly irregular, with more closer to Damascus, and after that just one or two, so it's kind of irregular. But they're really just protecting existing water sources. But in the 18th century, as we got with Madara, they actually created places where they deposited water, which would have been very expensive. And they created it so that you're always within a day's journey. So a day's journey, 3 times 12, what's that? 3 times 12, 24, 36, about 40 miles, say, apart by the 18th century. So they're very regularly based. And in terms of the upkeep, in the early 19th century, a big repair campaign was carried out in 1820s, repairing all the water systems. And so that was the last big repair job that was done, the big maintenance job. And after that, they're largely left to their fate. One interesting fact about the forts, though, that you discover when you're doing archaeological work is that the land that each fort occupies still belongs to the government in whichever country they're in. So the memory, so basically by building these forts, it did actually establish these as government land very early on. So yeah, but in recent years, there's been problems, and I mean, this is a general thing which you get with heritage sites, with historic sites over the world. As there's more people have cars, people are able to get to these remote sites, and so there is more damage being done. And so in Jordan, there has been some work restoring these buildings. The problem is, I suppose, is finding a use for the buildings, but there has been an interest, and there's also some interest in Saudi Arabia, although perhaps less, which is something that can be gone into perhaps. But yeah, but fortunately within Jordan, most of the ones that were still standing in the 80s still exist. Yeah.
Have you created like a map or something that someone could use if they were in Jordan, or is that something that you could easily research and do?
Yeah, I think that probably would be an interesting thing to do, and is a worthwhile thing, because I think one of the things that I think I'd like to do in terms of work on these really is do something to develop a heritage trail from Damascus, really, if that were possible. But certainly within Jordan it would be possible.
Yeah.
And really as a way of like finding out about other places, but also, I mean, it could easily be done like as, for example, as a hiking route or something. I mean, that would be something which would be both green and good in terms of conservation. But yeah, I think use is something that's quite important in terms of conservation.
Perhaps even a cycling route or something. I mean,
yeah, cycling, actually, that would be perfect. Yes, yeah. Yeah.
Well, you know where I am if you want help on that.
Yeah, okay, good, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think we've got time for maybe just last couple of questions. So, I mean, you talked about some of the militarization. Well, I don't know if that's an appropriate word for the 18th century castles. They're certainly more conducive to modern artillery and that kind of thing. I mean, what are they protecting from? Why do they need to have those defenses?
Well, in the year 1745, and perhaps there's some confusion about this, perhaps also 1747, but 1745 roughly, almost the entire pilgrimage caravan was wiped out by Bedouin. And this is a scandal. So this was probably the thing that motivated the Ottoman Sultans government state to actually provide better facilities. And in a sense, none of these forts would have had enough of a garrison to actually protect the whole caravan. But what they would have done is provided a secure route for communication. So an army could have been contacted, and so kind of signaling is one thing. But the other thing is another important change in the 18th century is that the Bedouin had, for the first time, had access to handguns, which they could have used from their horses. So the Bedouin, who hadn't really been difficult before, was suddenly a threat. Because an example I gave elsewhere, but in the 16th century, when somewhere near Unaiza in Jordan, the caravan was attacked, and the commander of the pilgrimage just got the military band to play some music, and the Bedouin just ran away because they're frightened of the music. But in the 18th century, this was very different. The Bedouin was suddenly very powerful. And the other side of it is the money that were paid to the Bedouin tribes is no longer enough in the 18th century. That's another factor.
So I'll end with one last question, and just since we are talking about the Hajj, so bringing it back to religious practice, to what extent do you see a kind of sacrality to this Hajj route? So I'm talking about things like biblical graves or shrines, if any exist at all, any saints or pious personalities buried in tombs or shrines along the route.
Yeah. Okay. Yes. Well, certainly there definitely were places, and I think they rose to prominence, and sometimes they kind of lessened in prominence depending on the current thinking at the time. One of the interesting things is one of the forts. I've forgotten which one at the moment in Saudi Arabia. It's not Datal Hajj, it's the one to the south of Datal Hajj. I'll find it in a minute. Was actually became a shrine itself. So because somebody who is believed to be pious died within the fort, the fort itself became a shrine. That's quite unusual. But most of the graves, though, most of the graves along the route are anonymous. And
are there a lot of those, by the way?
Who are talking? Are there what?
Are there a lot of those graves, by the way? I was really interested when you mentioned the grave and you had the pictures there. It was really cool.
Yeah. I think there's more graves than we can actually see. So I think a lot of graves were dug very quickly and just with the odd headstone, or maybe not even that. So I think there's a lot of anonymous graves. And according to Narwali, I just happened to notice the other day, he said that, and this in the 16th century, some important woman, noble woman, died on the route, and they just washed her body somehow and were able to bury her there and then. So I think there's a lot of cases of people being buried just anywhere in the middle of nowhere. But we also have cases, which I mention in my book, of people who really wanted to be buried in Mecca or a particular place who are actually carried all the way. So we have this one description of somebody being put inside a camel skin and carried all the way to Mecca, and it was like not very nice for the other pilgrims. But yeah, I think, yeah, within Saudi, it's difficult to ascertain. We know that there were various, there are also, for example, Madain Saleh al-Hijr, we know that there was, that has sort of Quranic resonance, and so we know that people were very much aware of that at the time when they passed through the area. And yeah, so there, I think there was very much an awareness of how this related increasingly as you got into Arabia to the Quran. And also, I suppose Damascus itself has a resonance both in terms of Islamic and Christian saints, like St. John in Damascus. But I suppose really one of the interesting things is from Damascus south, really, the Ottomans almost created a new route that really deliberately didn't obstruct with any of the normal routes that people are using, simply because of the vast numbers of pilgrims. And we have descriptions of the caravan being about, the road being about 40 meters wide. So this is like a serious a dislocation for people who lived along the route. So, but what did happen, we didn't know, a lot of pilgrims did do this. Sometimes they'd break off from the pilgrimage caravan and they'd go, for example, to Mount Nebo, maybe when Moses was meant, or to Nebi Musa, something like that, to see other religious sites, and then they could go back to the caravan, knowing that it's easy enough to catch up with it, because it was slow but constant.
Right. Well, that's all been really fascinating, and I wish we had more time, but I think you've answered a lot of our questions. Well, first of all, to all of viewers who've tuned in, I encourage you, if you're interested, to check out Andrew's books and his articles. If you look online, you'll find some of them, and I'm grateful that Andrew's uploaded his stuff, and I've certainly found it very useful in my research. I think my thanks to you, Andrew. That's been a really informative and enriching talk, and I'm sure our many viewers have really enjoyed it. So thank you so much, and I'm going to wrap up the session now. If everyone at home can give a virtual round of applause. I won't be able to hear it, but just do it.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thanks, guys.